In this video, we're going to work on Practice Exam 2, problem number 5. Problem number 5 is on variable and absorption costing. So we're given variable cost per unit. We're given fixed cost per unit. We know the product sells for $50. We're given production and sales data for the first 2 months of operations. And then moving on, we're given the absorption costing income statements for July and August. So requirement number 1, to determine the unit product cost under both absorption costing and variable costing. Number 2, we're supposed to prepare variable costing income statements for July and August. And then in part 3, we're supposed to reconcile the variable costing and absorption costing net operating incomes. Well, for requirement number 1, determining the unit product cost under absorption costing actually is relatively easy, because July, we would take the cost of goods sold divided by the units sold, so 420,000 divided by 20,000. And in August, we take the cost of goods sold, 588,000, divided by the units sold. But let's actually do this the right way. So to calculate the cost of goods sold under absorption costing, what you're going to do is you're going to add all of your manufacturing costs, your direct materials, direct labor, variable overhead, and fixed overhead together. Then you're going to divide by the number of units produced. So let's go ahead and do that. First, let's do this for July, and then we'll do it for August. So let's get started first with July. And let's do our calculations. So the first thing that we need to calculate for July is our direct materials. And for our direct materials, we're going to take the units produced multiplied by the direct materials cost per unit. So we're going to take 24,000 and we're going to multiply that by 5. Now we're going to notice that that's also the same for August, so I'll work with July and August at the same time. So for both July and August, we're going to take 24,000 and multiply it by 5. I'll put in the commas so we can see the numbers a little bit better. So for July and August, direct materials are $120,000. The next thing that we're going to do is our direct labor. And again, in both cases, we produced 24,000 units. So 24,000 multiplied by 9. So 216,000 in direct labor in both July and August. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to add our variable manufacturing overhead. So once again, for variable costs, we're just going to take the number of units produced and multiply it by the variable cost per unit. So for a variable manufacturing overhead, we're going to take 24,000, multiply that by 2. So we have 48,000 and 48,000. Now we're not going to add the variable selling and administrative, because variable selling and administrative is not a product cost. So the next thing that we're going to add is our fixed overhead. And for both months, our fixed overhead is $120,000. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add the total manufacturing costs. for both July and August, which is going to be exactly the same. So we have $504,000. Then what we do is we're going to divide it by the number of units produced. So in both cases, it's 24,000 for both months. And we're going to get a cost per unit. And I'm going to preset this for 2 decimal places. Gives us our cost per unit. So we're going to take 504,000 divided by 24,000, and of course for both months it's going to be $21. Now, as I said, we could have done it a lot more directly for July if we take the cost of goods sold and divide by the units sold. So for July we take 420,000, and in July only 20,000 units were sold. So 420,000 divided by 20,000 gives me exactly the same, $21. And of course for August, same thing. If we take the cost of goods sold and divide by the units sold, we're going to take 588,000 and divide by 28,000. And we should get exactly the same, $21 per unit. So we've got our unit product cost under absorption costing is $21 per unit. Now let's take a look at for the variable costing. So our cost per unit for variable costing is just the direct materials plus the direct labor plus the variable overhead. So under variable costing, we do not include fixed costs as a part of the variable cost of goods sold. Fixed costs are just subtracted in total. So our unit cost under variable costing I'm just going to scroll up on my other screen. All we're going to do is add 5. Nine plus 2. That should equal 16. Which gives us $16 per unit. Now that we know that we have the correct cost per unit, let's move on to requirement 2, which is to prepare variable costing income statements for July and August. So in our variable costing income statement, what we're going to do is we're going to start off with our sales. And then what we're going to do is we're going to subtract all of our variable expenses. Our variable expenses are our variable cost of goods sold, and then variable selling and administrative. We will calculate those in a moment. After we calculate our total variable expenses, we're going to calculate our contribution margin. So that is going to be our total variable expenses. And then our sales minus our variable expenses is going to equal our contribution margin. After our contribution margin, we're going to subtract our fixed expenses. We have 2 fixed expenses, our fixed manufacturing overhead and our fixed variable and administrative. I'm sorry, not fixed, selling and administrative, excuse me. So once we do those two, we subtract out our total fixed expenses to come down to our net operating income or loss. So let's go scroll up, do the calculations on the right, and put in the numbers down below. So we're going to start off with July over here. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put July here. And I'll make this a little smaller. And then we'll put August here so I can do the calculations. So the first thing that we're going to start off with is sales. So our sales are going to be the number of units sold multiplied by the selling price, which was given in the problem as 50. So our sales in July are going to be our 20,000 units sold multiplied by the 50. In August, we sold 28,000 units. So our sales are going to be 28,000 multiplied by 50. After our sales, we want to subtract our variable cost of goods sold. So notice down here, in requirement number 1, we already calculated under variable costing our unit product cost is $16 per unit. So we're going to use that to calculate our variable cost of goods sold. So we have in July, we sold 20,000 units, and our variable cost of goods sold is 16. In August, we sold 28,000 units, and our variable cost of goods sold is 16. Then, after our variable cost of goods sold, we're going to subtract our variable selling and administrative. So again, 20,000, and it was given in the problem that that's $2 a unit, and 28,000 multiplied by $2 per unit. So what I'm going to do is I'm now going to do the calculations and at least get us through the contribution margin before we subtract the fixed costs. So we're going to take 20,000 multiplied by 50. Don't worry, that just means the cell isn't wide enough to hold the number $1 million. 20,000 times 16 and 20,000 multiplied by 2. For August, 28,000 times 50, 28,000 multiplied by 16, and 28,000 multiplied by 2. Now to calculate the contribution margin, we just take the sales and subtract the variable costs. So I'm going to take the 1 million, subtract the 320,000 and subtract the 40,000. And for August, I'm going to take the 1,400,000, subtract 448, and subtract 56,000. Now, after our contribution margin, we're just going to subtract our fixed costs, which are our fixed manufacturing overhead and our fixed selling and administrative. Both of those are given in the problem as 120,000 and 172,000. And to calculate our operating income, we're just going to take our contribution margin, subtract our fixed overhead, and subtract our fixed selling and administrative. So we have 348,000 in July, and 896 minus 120 minus 172 gives us 604,000 in August. So let's just put all of those numbers in. So our sales, 1 million. Oh, 1,000,000. There we go. And August, 1,400,000. Now put in our variable expenses, 320,000, 448,000, 40,000, 56,000, so it already calculated our total variable expenses, and notice how our contribution margin is the same, 640 and 896. Now we're just going to put in the fixed overhead of 120,000 and our fixed selling and administrative of 172,000. And notice how we have the same net operating income, 348 and 604,000. Now in requirement number 3, we're just supposed to reconcile the variable costing and absorption costing net operating incomes. So let's go to requirement number 3. So in July, our variable costing operating income, we still have it on the board here, is 348,000. And in August, it was 604,000. We can see from requirement number, we can see from above that it's 368,000 and 584,000. So really, all you have to do is calculate the difference between the two. So for July, the difference between the two is going to be 20,000. Our absorption costing net income is 20,000 higher, and in August it's going to be 20,000 lower. Now to actually reconcile between the numbers, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the fixed manufacturing overhead, and I'm going to divide it by the number of units produced. So in both cases, our fixed manufacturing overhead is 120,000, and in both cases, our number of units produced is 24,000. So we have fixed manufacturing overhead of $5 per unit. Now you're going to notice that in each case, the difference between the number of units produced and the number of units sold is 4,000. So if I take the fixed manufacturing overhead per unit and multiply it by the number of units added to or subtracted from overhead, what that is going to actually equal is the difference between variable and absorption costing income. So in this case, as I said, it was 4,000 units, because in both cases, the difference between the number of units produced and the number of units sold is 4,000 units. We can take a look. It lets me highlight these. In both cases, the difference is 4,000 units. So 4,000 units multiplied by the $5 per unit means that the difference is going to be 20,000, which is exactly the difference between the two incomes. So what happens in the first year, because we produced more than we sold, $20,000 of the fixed overhead cost was added to net income the first year, and actually that one should be an add, and this one should actually be a negative $20,000. And now let's check my work, and we can see here that the answer is now complete and correct.